before the TED talk, I'll give you a very brief Ed talk. What I want to do is just for a few minutes, because we all want to get to watch this, is to just set in context these things that we're going to be dealing with tonight. Before the end of the 18th century, there basically wasn't any science, okay, as we know it. Basically, there wasn't an experimental method. It's different. If you look closely at what went on before Lavoisier, basically, around the time of the American Revolution and before the French Revolution, which, by the way, beheaded him, it was a totally different endeavor. And you see traces of that in this book, and the way people looked at miasma, instead of contagious theory of disease. The reason for that, in one word, is Aristotle. I won't go into it, but for 2,000 years, this set of ideas that knowing about the world was purely an intellectual process that didn't involve tinkering with things or changing conditions, basically doing experiments. That all truth came from ideas and deductive logic. 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 17th century, Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza overthrew that rationally. And that was at the end of the 17th century. And then, 100 years after that, Lavoisier emerges. And if you read Lavoisier's textbook that he published in 1787, it reads like a chemistry book today. If you look at anything before it, anything, you wouldn't recognize it as anything that we know anything about. So for a vast majority of Western civilization, starting from pre-Socratics, 500 years before Aristotle, or 400 years before, through the 17th century, and then the end of the 18th century, with Lavoisier, things really start to look like science. People are measuring things, they're doing experiments. Measurement is the big thing, okay? But things die slow, all right? It's not like, oh, Aristotle's out. That's just not the way it went. Things linger in history, and particularly in the history of ideas. And what you're seeing with, you can look at this, and the author sort of indicates, all these people, they just don't believe the truth. They're thinking, well, of course they're thinking about miasma, because this is part of their intellectual tradition. They argue from authority, like Aristotle did. Okay? So you're seeing that here. This is a very fascinating period. The 19th century is, in my opinion, for what it's worth, the greatest of all scientific centuries. Far superior to ours ahead. I don't like to make judgments like that. It's a little bit silly, but I will anyway. It's an amazing century, and you're looking right in the middle of it, 1854. Germ theory is not yet established, so John Snow is talking about things without a mechanism, right? Mendel did the same thing. He didn't know about chromosomes, but he got all the genetics right, 1866. Okay, and Snow is just the first person, I think, to really put this together in a way that was a little ahead of its time, because germ theory wasn't there. There's lots more to say about that. I'm not going to do it, because I want to join you in watching this presentation, and hopefully we'll have some interesting things to talk about afterwards.
If you haven't ordered yet, I generally find the rigatoni with the spicy tomato sauce goes best with diseases of the small intestine. So sorry, it just feels like I should be doing stand-up up here because of this setting. No, what I want to do is take you back to 1854 in London for the next few minutes, and tell the story in brief of this outbreak, which in many ways I think helped create the world that we live in today, and particularly the kind of city that we live in today. this period in 1854, in the middle part of the 19th century in London's history, is incredibly interesting for a number of reasons. But I think the most important one is that London was a city of 2.5 million people, and it was the largest city on the face of the planet at that point. But it was also the largest city that had ever been built. And so the Victorians were trying to kind of live through and simultaneously invent a whole new scale of living, the scale of living that we now call metropolitan living. And it was, in many ways, at this point in the mid-1850s, a complete disaster. They were basically a city living with a modern kind of industrial metropolis with an Elizabethan public infrastructure. So people, for instance, just to gross you out for a second, had cesspools of human waste in their basement, like 1 foot to 2 feet deep. And they would just kind of throw the buckets down there and hope that it would somehow go away. And of course, it never really would go away. And all of this stuff basically had accumulated to the point where the city was incredibly offensive to just walk around in. It was an amazingly smelly city, not just because of the cesspools, but also the sheer number of livestock in the city would shock people, not just the horses, but people had cows in their attics that they would use for milk that they would kind of hoist up there and keep them in the attic until literally their milk went out and they died, and then they would kind of drag them off to the bone boilers down the street. So you would just walk around London at this point and just be overwhelmed with this stench. And what ended up happening is that an entire kind of emerging public health system became convinced that it was the smell that was killing everybody, that was creating these diseases that would kind of wipe through the city every 3 or 4 years. And cholera was really the great killer of this period. It had arrived in London in 1832. And every 4 or 5 years, another epidemic would take 10,000, 20,000 people in London and throughout the UK. And so the authorities became convinced that this smell was this problem. We had to get rid of the smell. And so, in fact, they concocted a couple of early, kind of founding public health interventions in the system of the city, one of which was called the Nuisances Act, which they got everybody, as far as they could, to empty out their cesspools and just pour all that waste into the river. Because if we get it out of the streets, it'll smell much better. And, oh, right, we drink from the river. So what ended up happening, actually, is they ended up increasing the outbreaks of cholera because, as we now know, cholera is actually in the water. It's a waterborne disease, not something that's in the air. It's not something you smell or inhale. It's something you ingest. And so one of the founding moments of kind of public health in the 19th century effectively poisoned the water supply of London much more effectively than any modern-day bioterrorist could have ever dreamed of doing. So this was kind of the state of London in 1854. And in the middle of all this kind of carnage and offensive conditions, and in the midst of all this kind of scientific confusion about what was actually killing people, there was a very talented, classic 19th century multidisciplinarian named John Snow, who was a local doctor in Soho in London, who had been arguing for about 4 or 5 years that cholera was in fact a waterborne disease, and had basically convinced nobody of this. The public health authorities had largely ignored what he had to say. And he'd made the case in a number of papers and done a number of studies, but nothing had really kind of stuck. And part of what's so interesting about this story to me is that in some ways it's a great case study in how cultural change happens, how a good idea eventually comes to win out over much worse ideas. And Snow labored for a long time with this great insight that everybody kind of ignored. And then on one day, August 28th of 1854, a young child, a 5-month-old girl whose first name we don't know, we know her only as Baby Lewis, somehow contracted cholera, came down with cholera at 40 Broad Street. You can't really see it in this map, but this is the map that becomes the central kind of focus in the second half of my book. So in the middle of Soho, in this working class neighborhood, this little girl becomes sick. And it turns out that the cesspool that they still continue to have, despite the Nuisances Act, bordered on an extremely popular water pump, local watering hole that was well known for the best water in all of Soho, that all the residents from Soho and the surrounding neighborhoods would go to. And so this little girl inadvertently ended up contaminating the water in this popular pump. And one of the most terrifying outbreaks in the history of England erupted about 2 or 3 days later. Literally 10% of the neighborhood died in 7 days. And much more would have died if people hadn't fled after the initial kind of outbreak kind of kicked in. So it was this incredibly terrifying event. You had these scenes of entire families dying over the course of 48 hours of cholera alone in their one-room apartments, in their little flats. Just an extraordinary, terrifying scene. Snow lived near there, heard about the outbreak, and in this amazing kind of act of courage went directly into the belly of the beast because he thought an outbreak that concentrated could actually potentially end up convincing people that, in fact, the real menace of cholera was in the water supply and not in the air. He suspected an outbreak that concentrated would probably involve a single point source, one single thing that everybody was going to, because it didn't have the kind of the traditional slower path of kind of infections that you might expect. And so he went right in there and started interviewing people. He eventually enlisted the help kind of this amazing other figure who's kind of the other protagonist of the book, this guy Henry Whitehead, who was a local minister, who was not at all a man of science, but who was incredibly socially connected. He knew everybody in the neighborhood. And he managed to track down, Whitehead did, many of the cases of people who had drunk water from the pump or who hadn't drunk water from the pump. And eventually Snow made a map of the outbreak. He found increasingly that people who drank from the pump were getting sick, people who hadn't drank from the pump were not getting sick. And he thought about kind of representing that as a kind of a table of statistics of people living in different neighborhoods, people who hadn't, percentages of people who hadn't. But eventually he hit upon the idea that what he needed was something that you could see, something that would take, in a sense, a higher level view of all this activity that had been happening in the neighborhood. And so he created this map, which basically ended up representing all the deaths in the neighborhoods as black bars at each address. And you can see in this map the pump right at the center of it. You can see that one of the residents down the way had about 15 people dead. And the map is actually a little bit bigger. As you get further and further away from the pump, the deaths begin to grow less and less frequent. And so you can see this kind of something poisonous kind of emanating out of this pump that you could see in a glance. And so with the help of this map and with the help of kind of more kind of evangelizing that he did over the next few years and that Whitehead did, eventually, actually, the authorities slowly started to come around. It took much longer than sometimes we like to think in this story. But by 1866, when the next big cholera outbreak came to London, the authorities had been convinced, in part because of this story, in part because of this map, that in fact the water was the problem. And they had already started building the sewers in London. And they immediately went to this outbreak and they told everybody to start boiling their water. And that was the last time that London has seen a cholera outbreak since. So part of this story, I think, while it's a terrifying story, it's a very dark story, and it's a story that continues on in many of the developing cities of the world. It's also a story, really, that is fundamentally optimistic, which is to say that it's possible to solve these problems if we listen to reason, if we listen to the kind of wisdom of these kinds of maps, if we listen to people like Snow and Whitehead, if we listen to the locals who understand what's going on in these kinds of situations. And what it ended up doing is making the idea of large-scale metropolitan living a sustainable one. When people were looking at 10% of their neighborhoods dying in the space of 7 days, there was a widespread consensus that this couldn't go on, that people weren't meant to live in cities of 2.5 million people. But because of what Snow did, because of this map, because of the whole series of kind of reforms that happened in the wake of this map, we now take for granted that cities of 10 million people, cities like this one, are in fact sustainable things. We don't worry that New York City is going to collapse in on itself quite the way that Rome did and be 10% of its size in 100 years or 200 years. And so that, in a way, is the ultimate legacy of this map. It's a map of deaths that ended up creating a whole new way of life, the life that we're enjoying here today. Thank you very much.
Just a couple of sentences, and then I want to ask you for your questions. Scientists just don't believe things unless they're proven. It's very easy to look at this and, like you said, they didn't listen. Right? You can see this in our times now. The standards for what's true in science are just a little bit higher and a little bit different from matters of pure opinion. And without a mechanism, without the germ theory, which didn't come out for another 10 years after this, without the isolation of Vibrio cholera by Koch in the 1880s, a mechanism, it's hard hard to believe. And one of the things that I just want to bring to your attention when we look at history, it's not just like us moved back a few hundred years. It's really different. And the ideas are different. So I just want to point that out. And any topics you want to bring up, they don't need to address me, or I don't need to be involved, but I can maybe help pass them around if any comments or questions.
So,
Yes, ma'am.
So are you saying that a lot of people didn't believe this was the case, and so the deaths continued because of that?
People, we know now that contagianism, as it was known, the theory that communication, the communicability of human disease is correct. And we know that because we know about bacteria, we know, and viruses, and we know how they get into us, and we know about them. Okay, but imagine a world where you don't know anything. There's people get sick. That's all you know. And this was a world that was not that far away from us, really, few generations. Okay, what do you believe? Why would anybody believe the contagious theory over the miasma, which has had the longevity? It's an idea that had been out there for a long time. Okay, so eventually things change, but very slowly and on the basis of evidence. He didn't really have evidence, except actually in 1849, 5 years before this takes place, he had gathered together lots of Snow being he, gathered together lots of data, and it's really a nice piece of work, very, very brilliant. But you know, where's the beef? You know, there wasn't anything in it that really said this is it. It was correlations, just like you saw here. He had done this map almost a decade before. I mean, this was, I think, as the author points out, you know, this was a good opportunity for him to consolidate these views in a public light because he really believed it was true and felt it would do the public a lot of good. And it did. And that's an interesting point, too, because one of the last places to accept the germ theory of disease is where it was invented in France. You know, Louis Pasteur in the 1860s published his germ theory, and they didn't like it. America didn't like it. We had people here who didn't believe in germ theory of disease in the 1890s. The medical book, if you look at the medical books from that period, it's like looking at the Middle Ages. You know, we're far away from the center of what was science at that point in time. So eventually things come around, and we have these disputes in our lives too. Global warming. Is there global warming? You know, cutting taxes, does it create jobs or not? All these questions that come up all the time. You know, and to really accept something as being true, you know, we really do need a demonstration of it, and he didn't have it. So he was obviously right, and he did something tremendously useful. And Lister, Joseph Lister, surgeon, just took Pasteur's ideas, said, I believe this, I'm going to start disinfecting my operating room. And he cut the deaths from like something huge to something tiny. He didn't know what it was. So that kind of thing can be okay in terms of, you know, pragmatic, in terms of the outcome, that it does something useful and good and beneficial. But that's not what science does. Science is a sieve. That you need mechanisms, you need demonstrations, you need data other than just correlations. And if you want to think about correlations, think about all the stuff that we read about diet. You know, aspirin causes heart disease. I don't know. You have all these things that everything does this and everything does that, and it's just based on regressions and statistical analysis. Lots of it's not going to turn out to be true. So all these things that I don't criticize that. It's the way humans are, right? But I think it's good to keep in mind that people have always been like that. And that not accepting something that's true doesn't mean you're dumb. It just means you have a different opinion at that time. Because these were educated people who disagreed. It wasn't like dodos or anything. I mean, they were professors of medicine here and there. Yes, ma'am.
Now, Snow, what was his profession? Was he a doctor?
He was a medical doctor and a surgeon.
Okay.
And back in those days, his big contribution to medicine really was in anesthesia.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Somebody, I forget who said it, but somebody said, if you could be born any time that you want, when would it have been? And they said, any time after the invention of anesthesia. Right? And ether was first put to use in Mass General, and also by a dentist who used to get high with his friends on it in Georgia at the same time. But the first medical application was really accredited to Mass General. And chloroform. Those were the two volatile substances that put people out. But dose is a big deal. The difference between an effective dose and a lethal dose with ether is minuscule. A lot of people, very, very tough anesthetic. And of course, I had my appendix out under ether when I was in. It wasn't on the dining room table.
I was 4.
Yeah, I was 9. Yeah, exactly. So,
Yes. Yeah.
who can forget? But I'm getting flashbacks now of it, so I don't know. But yeah, so that was his. He understood, because science had come in, chemistry particularly. They understood that the amount of ether that comes up from a liquid reservoir is related to the temperature. It's also related to the pressure, but we'll just assume atmospheric pressure doesn't change much. Okay, so in other words, if it's warmer, like when you dry your clothes, a hot day is a good one, right? Because things evaporate, and it's the same for ether. So he realized that you had to take that into account, and he developed tables for chloroform and ether. It's a huge contribution, really. He was a very brilliant man, and this was a really good idea. But it was in the air. There's practically nothing that comes up in science that one heroic person, it makes really good books, and this is a good book. It's really well written, really well written. But the fact is that, the lone scientist with the right idea, fighting with everybody else, it's not necessarily the most accurate representation. The germ theory was in the air.
So to speak.
Manner of speaking.
He decided it was in the water again. How did he decide that the column came from?
Before this, in 1849 publications that he had one in 1849 and one in 1851 that I found. Okay, and other towns where this had come up, there were 2 places really, really close together. They practically separated only by a wall. There were 2 courtyards or something. And one of them had one well and the other had the other. And everybody in one house was dropping dead from cholera, which is actually a horrible way to go. But, and the other wasn't, and they're right next door. So he really was convinced that it was the water. Okay, and as it turns out, it is. And just one other relationship I was talking about before about this, that 95% of the cholera strains, types of different specific sort of breeds of cholera, 95% of them are not virulent. They don't cause the disease. Only 5% do. And the reason that they do is that they have they have 2 genes that come into them from a virus that lives in bacteria. There are plenty of viruses that live in bacteria. And these actually get into the chromosome and they divide right along with it. So only strains that carry those genes do it. And one, it causes the attachment of the organism to the gut. Doesn't attach, can't get in. And the other actually turns off a chloride pump. Make a long story short, sodium and chloride don't get in across the gut, and therefore water comes out to reduce their concentrations. Osmosis, you may have studied in high school. If you have a high concentration of something here and a low there. So anyway, but it just basically, it's a chemical pump. It sucks the water out. It's complete dehydration. It's really awful. Complete. And the only treatment is drink lots of liquids, and if that doesn't work, IV. Okay, so it's massive dehydration. I mean, of a scale that's really hard to imagine. The blood actually thickens. It's the nightmare. As is most infectious disease. People used to die from. I would have been dead 100 times every time I cut myself up. We have a farm in New Hampshire. You know, I'd be dead probably 50 times already. You know, people don't understand the horror of infectious disease. And yes, sorry.
You mentioned the word miasma, and he talked about bad air. Could you talk a little bit about that theory? Because that was the main theory at the time. I mean, how was that different from the germ theory?
It was different because it didn't specify what was in it.
I mean, they just thought the air was bad, so if you breathed it, you got sick?
Well, malaria means bad air.
So they thought the air, the smell and the air itself made you sick?
They had no bleeding idea what it was. And this is what's so fascinating about studying. I'm a scientist. You know, my training is in biochemistry and genetics. But the history is really, really fascinating. And you don't really get it as much in school. I'm going to get to your question in a second. Because they concentrate on social and political history. But the history of the mind is really the history of how we understand the world around us. They don't talk much about that. And to me, it's, I think at least equally important. And so I really enjoyed looking into it. They had no mechanism for anything. Aristotle was mechanism free. Right? The four humors. This was Hippocrates before Aristotle. Okay? A couple hundred years maybe before. But the idea that health and disease are related to balance, like yin and yang, only there were four of them. Earth, air, fire, and water. Okay? And in the body, they were different. There were humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and bile. Okay? And, bloodletting, that was done until the late 19th century. My grandparents, late 19th century. And the reason they did that was they felt that certain diseases came from too much blood. An imbalance among the four humors. So they might have certain treatments that they felt would increase or decrease blood. So if you have too much blood, inflammation. They say, was it rubor, tumor, red, swollen, and sore. There are four Latin words they use to describe inflammation. Well, it looks like there's a lot of blood in there, and there is. So they figured the way to treat that is to take the blood out. That makes perfect sense, really. I mean, it's wrong.
Wrong for a long time.
That's my point. Okay, one more thing. Yeah, about the miasma. So no mechanism. And if you think about it, Jon Snow didn't have one either.
Right. Yeah, guts.
They didn't know about bacteria causing disease for another decade. Really. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
When
off.
did they start doing the transfusions?
Well, actually, there were ancient pictures of that, putting sheep blood into people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a print I came across today, actually, I looked at phlebotomy because I was interested. I was Googling away today. It was a high Google day. So, yeah, that was, I think, in the 18th century, maybe even before. But modern transfusions, actually, as medical procedures, they wouldn't have been, for one thing, there wasn't really a way to store blood.
Even type blood? What type of blood?
Well, that would be,
Right.
let's assume you couldn't type it, so a lot of people would die from the immune response, right? But in addition to that, no way to store it. You basically take it warm from one person, put it in another. I don't know the answer to that specifically when it was first medically used successfully in the U.S., but I'll look into that.
I thought rats caused the cholera in the Middle Ages. I thought it was the
That's
rat.
the plague.
It's the
That's
plague.
The plague. Oh,
It
that
was the fleas
that
on
was
the
it.
rats.
Rats had the fleas, and the fleas bit people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
there's
that's
actually-
true.
Diseases played a huge role in human history. There are famous books on that. Zinser's book, Rat's Lice in History, and
That's life in history.
yeah, it's a famous book. And people go to different places, like the Crusades, let's say. It's a long way to the Holy Land from central France, right? So Saint Bernard preaches a crusade, like in Vézelay or something, and then they all go running and to Jerusalem and pick up a lot of things along the way that you haven't seen before, and you bring them back. I mean, there's a huge influence. Trade. One of the reasons that contagionism was unpopular was that it interferes with business, right? Because along with it is you have contagionism here, and right next to it you have quarantine. Okay, that's a bad thing for trade. People who are in the business of trading don't want ships held up at sea because there's a disease rampant on the shores from which they had come. So these things definitely weave in.
Are we too clean today, using all these hand sanitizers?
No, I'm not.
I was raised on a farm without indoor plumbing.
So was my
We
wife.
never washed our hands,
Yeah.
unless they were dirty.
Well, let's see. Are we too clean?
Dirt. Are we too clean today?
The only evidence for too clean that I really know of is, what's it called? I was blank out on it. Kissing disease.
Mono.
That's it, right. Mono. Yeah, only the rich kids got it, my neighborhood, anyway, because they hadn't been out there seeing Epstein-Barr virus like the rest of us out there, like getting it, knocking it out. So if you don't see it until you're like adolescent, you get mono from it on pretty good frequency. It's the same virus, and everybody's sort of got it. But too clean, I would have to say, is being a scientist. Too clean for what?
Well, you lose your immunity to,
Okay, well, we would have to determine that.
yeah.
Okay, in the case of mono, there's some evidence that if you haven't seen it before, but we don't know the whole panoply of, the menu of diseases that we might be exposed to. So I think it's a difficult question to answer. And obviously sanitation, as so on this is a big thing.
Yeah, without the
But
water.
when we go to our farm, I don't wash my hands either. What for? You're just going to get them dirty in another 5
If
minutes.
the water was ever tested. I don't know if any of those farmers ever tested the water, but I do know that there was a pump that you never drank
Where
out
did you grow up?
That's right.
in Iowa, in the middle of Iowa.
Yeah, and the pumps that were by the barn were for the animals, and the
Yeah.
ones that were up a little higher and in a different place were for the house.
But I don't remember state testers coming out and testing the water
Well, they
ever.
didn't.
They probably
They
didn't.
probably didn't have tests.
But they seem to know where to place the pumps.
It was
After
pre-test.
Pre-test.
I've never had anybody test my well. I've got well water.
Yeah, we do too. up
I've
there.
never had anybody come and test my well.
Did we have ours tested? No.
I mean, and I've lived there all these years and I'm living, so.
Yeah, but we're uphill from the privy.
What?
We're uphill from the privy.
Oh, okay, right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's all about.
Yeah, I have a
Things go
septic
down.
tank and
No.
there's a farm next door.
No. It's a really fine discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Just along those lines, do you want to just tell the story of Pasteur and the surgeon that didn't believe in what he did?
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to start.
Pasteur had a real problem. He was not a medical doctor. Right? He was a chemist. Okay, and he got his advanced degrees in chemistry, and there was an Academy of Sciences. Okay, in France, Institut de France, the French Institute. There's a Academy of Medicine and Academy of Science, and they're not the same. Okay, and we're not. So when he was proposing his germ theory of disease, saying that things like scalpels, surgical instruments should be clean, one of the physicians who was there said, Monsieur Pasteur says that we should clean our scalpels. And I'm old, I have to lean on something. He says, I'm going to clean mine.
It's a true story.
Oh, you can't beat the French. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a great place. It's really a great place. But things like that, and of course they kept all the transactions of the academies are public record now. And these days, I got the librarians, you may know, but if you go on to Gallica, that's a French National Library site, digital assets, you get all these things scanned. I mean, you're sitting there looking at Lavoisier's textbook. You know, I mean, it's really remarkable. So you can all these records of conversations and arguments, and there are lots of them. Scientists fight with each other all the time. All the time. In fact, Pasteur has like a whole series of fights. He has one with a guy named Pouchet about spontaneous generation. He has others about, you know, cleanliness during surgery, and then he has them with Koch, actually the German microbiologist, the co-inventor of microbiology, so-called, you know, Pasteur and Koch. Koch on the technical side, all the ideas came from Pasteur. Okay, but Koch's technical innovations are remarkable, and they still are in use. Okay, but they had a vicious fight, of course, the French and the Germans, do I have to tell you? And they were on opposite. They were both alive in the Franco-Prussian War, which was a huge tragedy for France. It was the end of the Second Empire. Immediately, the emperor was captured, and there were violent feelings on both sides, as there have been until after the Second World War, really. Right, but so that played a role in it, a big role, actually. It was a very bitter difference of opinion. And then also he was defending his theory of fermentation against others. He had a particular theory that, you know, scientists fight all the time, and you see that in miasma or contagionism. They're going to fight about everything. It's part of the dialectic. It's part of the, you know, how the mind works in deciding what's right. You know, put two things that seem different together and see what comes out when you argue. So, you know, it's lots of it. Never a dull moment if you're a scientist. Good career. Yes.
I have a question / comment. We're hearing about in the news a whole bunch about the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And of course, Stephen King's The Stand was one of the books that terrified me, and I really think that could happen someday. So
I don't know the book. Tell me what happened.
94% of the population dies of the flu, and it was just made.
Flu of 1918 killed how many? 20, 50 million? It was tens of millions.
Yeah.
More than-
So do you see something like that happening again, especially with the antibiotic-resistant bacteria that we hear about?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yeah. Now, we have a friend who's, I'm talking about Bruce, his mother, just a quick, right? Woman, so has had sniffles and give me an antibiotic, doctor, and, you know, have this and give me this antibiotic, give me that. You know, a lot of patients self-prescribe and put pressure on physicians to give them certain treatments. Anyway, she's very, it's incidental, but she's very wealthy, she and her husband. So it's not a matter of she wasn't getting good care. Believe me, she and her husband built a wing at this hospital. Okay, and she died. She died of a massive infection because everything was resistant. Okay, she was in her 70s. I mean, she wasn't like
And
ancient.
she died in 3 days.
3 days.
She got sick, and by the time they recognized she had a bacterial infection, they couldn't do anything about it, and she just slipped away. It was amazing. So it is frightening.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So the drug resistance is in bacteria is not always, but often associated with things like I started telling you in cholera. You know, there are these viral, bacterial virus genes that contain the 2 genes for virulence that make it pathological. Okay. Drug resistance is not on viruses like that, it's on other elements, the DNA, separate from the chromosome in bacteria. And it can carry lots of these genes. MDR, multiple drug resistance. Okay, and as soon as you take an antibiotic, what you're doing is we call selection. You're selecting for the growth of resistant organisms. Bacteria divide, like in a healthy environment, like every 20 minutes. You go through the math. Okay, I mean, 2, 4, 8, 16, da 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 da. Very quickly, you're up in billions. Like it's anyway. So if you have one drug-resistant bacterium in there out of like this whole mess of bacteria, and you kill everything else, you just make it easier for it to grow. So every time you have something that kills bacteria in your body, you are selecting for the growth of resistant organisms. So the overuse of antibiotics, okay, and let me tell you, the only thing that stands between us and the Black Death, I think really, antibiotics. 1929, Fleming accidentally discovered an organism that made penicillin, okay, and the changed the world. Right? I mean, it's things like Civil War, infection, you know, surgery. That's 1860s, right? Before around this time, and so there are just so many antibiotics. I worked in biotechnology for many years, and before I came out here, and antibiotics are big money makers for big pharmaceutical companies, and they're always looking for more. Okay, and there's a reason for that. I mean, there's a huge threat behind this dam. You know, that's sort of building up, and so multiple drug resistance. I assume that's what the book was about. Stephen King's a smart guy, he probably knows.
Yeah, it was more. Yeah, it was so quick that everybody was gone.
What?
But yeah, there was no cure. Basically, just the flu, and there was nothing that anybody could do about
Okay, that's a viral disease. Yeah, but
So,
And which flu epidemic was this? Which book was this?
oh, Stephen King's The Stand. Complete,
right,
complete
right.
fiction, of course.
Right, but it's sort of, it sounds like it takes the thread from the 1918 pandemic.
Exactly.
yeah, that
then-
came from horses, they think, actually, because a lot of work horses, and a lot of them in the military and all over. Lots of horses. I think was it the Poles in the Second World War had a cavalry charge against the Nazis when they came in 1938. So there were lots of horses around. And now that there's horse meat, about that crisis in Europe. It's good. I used to eat it actually. When you know what it is, like it's stuck into your cheeseburger or anything. But, yeah, it's interesting. There's this cultural difference. Like people in the south of Europe eat it. French, Italian, Spanish a little bit. In north of Europe, it makes them sick. The thought of doing it, like in England or Scandinavia, if you mention eating horse, it's a gag reflex for sure. And so they have contaminated. There was a French company that was buying it and putting it into. They were processors, and they were putting it into things that they said were frozen foods. And it's supposed to be beef.
Yeah.
I used to joke about that when I was a kid. I said, I don't know what was in that hamburger, but when I walked out of the restaurant, I broke out into a gallop. But I used to eat in a little restaurant in Paris. I spent 2 years there, and that served it, and I did have it a number of times.
Now, when you say it's like that and it was in the horses, did you get it from the horse through the air or through their blood, or did you actually get it from eating? Like they talk about the swine flu and the bird flu and the horse flu. Is that something that could pass through the air, or do you have to ingest that?
Okay, It's not, actually, the most common way to get virus is get them on your fingers and rub your eye. It comes in, yeah, that's the biggie,
Okay.
because we do that all the time.
So would you have to pet the horse on the outside
No,
or
it
touch
wouldn't
the
be
horse manure?
directly from the
or-
horse, it would be a horse virus that, well, we always touch it, people who work with horses touch them all the time. Right? Give them sugar, they slobber all over you. You know, so, yeah, it's a virus that, it wouldn't be the horse virus. It would be a horse virus that's sort of hybridized with a human virus.
But you would get it through
The way
air contact or skin, not because I had a
mucous
horse burger.
membranes.
Okay.
So inside your mouth, your nose, eyes.
So cooking my horse meat or my bird or my pig well isn't going to protect me from these viruses because they're actually airborne or from a mucus.
It would come from the
related.
live animal generally. Viruses
Yeah,
are
okay.
not too persistent. I mean, one exception would be something like hepatitis B viruses. That can hang out for weeks. You know, it's big deal at crime scenes. You know, just loaded with blood. So, but most viruses are generally not going to, unless they're in something living, they're not going to make it. Or on a surface, they're not going to make it. So it's usually fairly, yes ma'am.
Maybe last week or so, I saw on television there's a new virus out that has absolutely no antibiotic response to it. And they're isolating these people, these certain people that have it in hospitals. Did you hear anything about that?
I haven't. No, but
it's-
actually, but hospital's the worst place to be.
No, I know. But I mean, they said there's absolutely no antibiotic that will cure it.
Well,
Nothing.
a virus
No.
wouldn't be subjected,
Yeah.
susceptible to
Or
antibiotics.
any kind of medicine that they could use
Yeah.
to cure it.
Well, virus is basically, it's palliative treat. You treat the symptoms, pretty much.
You got to shake that off with your own immune system.
Yeah,
Don't cure a virus, you
exactly.
treat it.
Bacteria,
That's-
and this is the thing.
That's
Viruses, of course, they replicate, but pretty slow, and they can do all kinds of bad things to you. But bacteria just like take you over. I mean, you leave a piece of meat out, sometimes. Watch what happens to it. Right. Well, that's what bacteria do to you from the inside if you have a bacterial infection. We had one of my colleagues had a little boy who got meningitis, and they did a spinal tap on him, and it was turbid. I mean, it was cloudy. The spinal fluid was cloudy. He lived. He was deaf, but he lived. But it's scary. It's very scary.
So that's bacteria then in
Oh,
the
yeah.
spinal.
Very, we don't think about it because we have all these antibiotics.
I know.
But the other side of that is we have all these resistant bacteria. I was talking before about, people who have AIDS, for instance, or have all kinds of stuff growing in them. And among these were like tubercle bacilli, the organisms that cause tuberculosis. And so, of course, they treat people. And so now we have huge in New York City, like quadruple the number of multiply drug-resistant TB. And we don't think about TB too much now. But those of you who like romantic poetry, for instance, you notice that, why did they all die at 30?
Yeah.
Well, they all died, or you like La Boheme, you like opera.
White plague.
Yes, that is.
I grew up in Saranac Lake where all the people came
Oh,
to cure for the white plague. My grandmother and all my relatives, they took care of people at cure colleges. So my mother even still carries the tuberculin back. I mean, you can have it dormant in your body.
Right.
that's another thing, exactly. And with cholera, not everybody who gets exposed to it gets it.
Right. Yeah.
And
With cholera?
Yeah. You can carry it dormant for your whole life, or you can say she got pneumonia or got really sick, it might become active. But these are new, I think. And it should be scary for people. I mean, even in high school, I had friends who had to go to the sanitarium. So they call it the white plague.
Well, again, we don't live in a world where this is like all the time. We're afraid of AIDS up there, and we have all kinds of. The microbial world is really out to get us. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's no détente because they're hungry and we're full of food. So, but it's very scary, and the multiple drug resistance is a huge issue. Drug resistance in general. We give too many people too many shots too quickly. And partly because they ask for it. And one of the big problems in medical care is people telling their doctors what to do. There are two sides to that, of course, right? It's your body, you shouldn't have some say, but on the other hand, it may not be the best input in all cases. This particular case of our friend's mother basically killed herself. Anything else? Okay, well, it's been a real pleasure, and I'm not far if anybody ever wants to get in touch about these things. So,
You
please.
had a handout too, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if people took it. I didn't expect so many people, so I only printed out like a dozen of these, but
Actually, if you give me one of the copies, I'll make more for everybody.
okay, thanks. Yeah, these are, like I said, I was Googling away today, so I have some websites that are relevant to the topic about Pasteur, Lister, snow, cholera, that kind of thing. So if you're interested,
So with cholera, if it's dormant, and you're the lucky one that doesn't get sick, can you still pass it in feces?
it's got to be ingested.
But you could contaminate water, even though
Yes.
just
Yeah,
because
I don't
you're a
know.
carrier.
I don't know for what period of time. Yeah, for instance, like it attaches to cells in the gut, and that's undoubtedly what has occurred. Okay. Well, everybody's cell surfaces, like the blood types, ABL, that's the surface of red blood cells. Well, we're different. That's why we have these you have to be screened before you give a transplant. We have surface things on all of our cells, and some of them just may not be cholera friendly, and that don't let the bacterium attach. You see what I'm saying?
But you still could pass it out and contaminate the water.
Yeah, but it would be greatly diluted. I don't know how much. Anyway, yes, theoretically you could do that.
So everybody that drinks the dirty water doesn't always get cholera.
No.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean people.
But now the baby, was she the first to get it from that pup?
Apparently.
Yeah, okay, and then he kind of went
Yeah.
up with.
He was loaded for bear.
Yeah,
He knew
right.
what was going on.
Yeah.
He didn't discover this in
Right,
1854. He'd been thinking about this for a good long time.
Right,
Very well, he was brilliant.
yeah.
And he was up on the literature, he knew what was going on in France. He knew this a lot. Scientific community gossip.
Well, wasn't the question was always, where did the baby get the cholera? If she got it from the well, why didn't as many people get sick at the same time as she did? And that was always the mystery in this
Baby
particular
though, her mother
story.
could have taken her somewhere, she could have had a drink.
Who knows? I mean, she was an infant, she had just been born. And that was always the question, was how did the infant end up with it as they first, that her diarrhea then went into the basement and contaminated the well and made everyone sick. The theory was they never found out why the baby got sick in the first place. Yes. It's very interesting. The people who did not get sick worked at the brewery. The minister didn't get sick because he drank wine all the time. The doctor drank tea. So there were certain things that people did who didn't get sick because it was by nature of how they lived their lives. So if you drank beer or liquor, obviously, or you boiled your water for tea.
I'd rather drink.
Yeah, me too. It was like, well, why do these people not get sick? And then he was putting all of that, like you said, he had been studying it for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But then I can see if they don't think, and with Pasteur, they laughed at him, there were all kinds of cartoons about the unseen beings. Because, you couldn't see them, and they
So how could they be
ridiculed the
there?
man mercilessly in cartoons. But if you didn't know about unseen beings, and a baby got sick and another man didn't, and you wouldn't know that because he wasn't drinking the water that was, you might think it was just they breathed bad air. I can see.
It's still
But it
incredible
would be
that it took
scary.
that many centuries for somebody to come up with the idea.
Isn't it
Aristotle.
amazing?
Trust me. In the West. We can't begin to relate to the influence that Greek philosophers had on Western, so we can't begin to relate to it. And
You mean that interfered with progress?
well, here's how it goes.
Of a certain kind, I guess.
Yeah, I know that this is the way it goes. From that I can deduce A, B, C, D, and that's the way it is. You want to experiment? No, you can't alter anything. Okay, people didn't
I see.
manipulate
Yeah.
experimental conditions.
It was all logic.
But for that
This,
many
this, and
centuries
therefore
after
this.
Aristotle, I
Well,
find it astonishing.
Aristotle got into the church through Thomas Aquinas.
Oh.
Okay, I mean, actually they kicked him out for a while, but then he got back in. Okay, and so you know, it was more than just the Greeks at that point. It was a structure.
Of the Catholic Church.
And scholastic philosophy, they're arguing with each other logically all the time about all these things they don't know about. You know, and very powerful. And once there was some evidence, and that didn't really happen. I mean, if you look at great scientists like Galileo, he found like natural laws. He wasn't he wasn't trying to figure out. He was trying to describe how nature worked, which is a big step. Archimedes did too, like long before. But really, saying what happens if I mix these two things together, that's 18th century.
How about Da Vinci? Didn't he study?
I don't know his work in chemistry, if any. They're really, I mean, I don't like to say these kinds of things because I think the history is fascinating. Alchemy is interesting. It's all interesting. But there really wasn't any science as we know it before Lavoisier. 1743 to 1794 when they beheaded him at Place de la Concorde.
Not even in the Eastern world that wasn't under the domination of the church.
There was alchemy, and they had certain theories that, you know, these elements were combined, and they only had 4 of them, right? And the transmutation was a big, even in China. In China, like in the 4th century, you know, there were people that were trying to. Gold was considered to be. There's always been a tie-in between chemistry and medical. People said that, you know, Partington, a famous historian of science, says that chemistry is a hybrid between metallurgy and pharmacy. He's right. So the idea that gold had medical properties in China was prevalent. They didn't have a Lavoisier. I mean, you've got to really see the impact of a person on the way things go.
How do you spell his name?
Lavoisier.
Also, those men were powerful, and then they got into that whole thing of alchemy and sorcery and
Magic.
witching and magic, and the church jumped on them, and they beheaded people. So there wasn't a lot of motivation to do experimentation either, because if you were doing too much, you got
put a damper
beheaded
on
or
it.
whatever.
I think the church gets some bad press about these things. There are actually a couple of really good books on that.
Oh, good. Do you have the, do you know by
I can, if you give me,
Okay.
if you email me.
Heresy, I guess.
Heresy.
No, they you know, the advances in logic in the Middle Ages, you know, the 12th century to the 15th, you know, were huge. And
If you want to just get some of these.
Thank you.
I can email you and put it there. Or just take a sheet, yeah.
Okay.
Church only had a problem when it was doctrine. They had nothing against science. When it conflicted with doctrine. And the doctrine, I mean, there you go. It's Aristotle. Argument from authority. That's Aristotle.
Right.
From principles that we know. Well, how do you know them? Don't ask. This is true, and that's the way it is. And from that, I derive everything else. That's the way it went. You can't do science like that. And they didn't. For 2,000 years. And then it was Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza, really, that just refuted Aristotle and opened the doors. It was philosophy integrates itself in strange ways into other areas of life, human life. Yeah, Descartes, and it's no accident these things happened in France. Descartes was French, right? And Lavoisier made a great discovery, but it was he actually weighed things. You know, I'll tell you his big discovery. I can tell you his big discovery. Some of the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece said the same thing, but of course they didn't measure it. They said you can't get something from nothing, and you can't make nothing from something. Okay? Parmenides. It's true. You take that forward a couple thousand years, and you have the law of the conservation of matter. Okay, that is to say, if I take this paper and I burn it in the atmosphere, and I capture everything that's left, all the ash and the gas, and the CO2 and the water that come out as vapor, and I weigh it, it'll weigh exactly what the paper weighed, and the atmosphere in the jar. Okay, that was it. And once he understood that, and had the instruments, the French are really good crafts people, and he was very wealthy. And so he could have people make these instruments that were better than any ever had been made before. A balance, basically, it weighs things. That's it. Just understanding that you had to get back, because they had these theories, their invisible things came out. It was amazing, and he saw the implications of that, and he invented chemistry all by himself. Nothing like him before. Okay, and there were other people at the same time doing stuff, but of course, he also was an economist. There's another thing about the government not paying attention to these things. In France, the government, even in the old regime, had scientists to whom they listened. Okay, they started the Academy of Sciences in France, to advise. Lavoisier did geological surveys. I mean, this guy did amazing stuff, and he had economic theories, and because he understood balance, like bookkeeping. It is bookkeeping, only it's material bookkeeping, and we do need, I think, the input of specialists in these areas. We tend to be resistant to it here, for some reasons.
When you say here, you mean the United States?
I do.
Oh.
I remember, Stephen Chu just resigned as Secretary of Energy.
Yeah.
Stephen Chu has a Nobel Prize in physics. I mean, this is not an easy thing to get. Stephen Chu is really a smart man. And the American will say, so he's smart, what's he really know?
I know.
No, but it's American as cherry pie. It's just the way we are. And a lot of European countries, like France, I know best, but I think others as well. Just not the case. They really do believe that some people know more than the average person about specific areas, and they listen to them. Lavoisier worked they had him in the arsenal, and he and his wife actually moved there. They had a residence there in his laboratory, and he was working on gunpowder. And actually that worked to our advantage, because DuPont, before they came to the U.S., I think it was E.P. DuPont, Etienne. He was in love with Lavoisier's wife. Terribly in love with Lavoisier's wife. And there may have been something cooking before Lavoisier was killed, you never know. But after Lavoisier's execution, he begged Mrs. Madame Lavoisier to marry him, and she wouldn't do it. He said, come to America. Well, his son came over, and we have DuPont, de Nemours, nylon. But they were actually the largest gunpowder manufacturers, dynamite manufacturers in the world for a long time. And that really comes right from France. That was, chemistry was a French science for a long time. Anyway, as you can see, we live in a fascinating world where all kinds of interesting things have happened, and we're fortunate to be able to find out about just some of them. There's so much that went on, and I'm a little fresh on this because I'm teaching history and philosophy of science now in the fall semester. So I did it for the first time last time. Well, they got to think it's something to do with me.
Bay Path?
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay. And did you write the question?
I said
Yes.
church versus
Good.
music versus medicine.
Good, thanks.
And anybody that hasn't read Ghost Math, we have copies at the library, and it's really well written. It reads, actually, it always makes the list of books that read like fiction, but
Yeah,
they're nonfiction. So he knows how to tell a story.
He's a great writer.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
easy. It's
just
fun
like
to
he
read.
speaks. He writes very well.
And I want to thank you for
And thank
inviting
you.
Christine Bacon. I want to thank her for passing the
Yes!
passing the board to me.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure.